Your next storyteller is an activist and a public health professional, and this is her first time doing a story, so please give it up for Elisabet Eppes.
But sometimes I said, sometimes I hear my voice, I hear my voice, I hear my voice, and it's been...
Got my gal pals on the couch. All right. Whew. So my family and I squeezed into the tiny exam room at the veterinarian's office to say goodbye to our black lab, Mojo. Mojo had led a long and mostly happy life, but had recently gotten sick and was having trouble moving around. It was time to end his suffering, but that didn't make it any easier. Afterwards, we went back to my dad's house, my stepmom, dad, brothers, sister, and me, and talked and cried, reminiscing about Mojo's life. And in case anyone's wondering where the name Mojo came from, it is after the second Austin Powers movie. Don't ask, my family is really weird. So I had a date scheduled for later that night that had been scheduled prior to me knowing we were going to put the dog down that afternoon. And rather than cancel the date, I thought, what the hell? I don't want to sit at home all night thinking about this. I might as well go on the date. It was my second date with the guy I had met on OkCupid. I went over to his house. We hung out, drank some beer, smoked some pot, and had sex. And I'm not sure if it was the beer and weed combo or me being distracted from the sadness of the day, but I wasn't particularly safe in this sexual encounter. I wasn't taking birth control pills at the time, and he didn't wear a condom. But everything was okay because he had pulled out before coming, and we all know how effective the pull-out method is, right? Super effective, like 60% effective at least. So at this point, you might know where this story is heading. A few weeks later, I started getting really nauseous, and my period wasn't showing up. When I complained to my mom about how I was feeling, she was like, Elisabet, do you think you might be pregnant? And I was like, no way, Mom. I only had sex once in the past few months, and we had used protection. I may or may not have clarified to my mom that the protection we used was the pull-out method, but that's neither here nor there. So I went out, even though I was convinced that I wasn't pregnant, I went out and bought a test just to be sure. As I held the test in my hand and the plus sign started to show up, I was still in denial. Nah, this must be a mistake, I thought. The plus sign's too faint. But as the seconds ticked by and the plus sign got darker, I realized it wasn't a mistake. I was terrified. I guess if circumstances had been different, I might have been excited to be pregnant. I do love kids after all, and I envision raising kids at some point in my life. But the timing sucked. I was broke, unemployed, and crashing at my older brother's house. So not the ideal circumstances to bring a human being into the world. And I was also at the early stages of my professional career, and having a kid would have totally thrown those plans out of whack. Plus, I wasn't about to try and raise a kid with this guy that I had only gone on a few dates with. And don't worry, I'll get back to him later. So for these reasons, I knew that I had to get an abortion. Even though it was an easy decision, I still felt terrible about it. I was guilty about not going through with having the baby. I was anxious about the procedure itself. And most of all, I was furious at myself for letting this happen. I've always been really pro-choice, but it was one of those things where I was pro other women's choices. I never thought I'd have to be pro my own choices. Plus, I didn't know anyone my age that had had an abortion, and so I felt really isolated. I had a certain image in my mind of the type of woman who needs an abortion. A careless teenager who either doesn't have access to birth control or doesn't know about it. As an otherwise responsible 27-year-old, I did not have an excuse. I played that fateful evening back in my mind over and over again and thought about all the ways it could have gone differently. Like a choose-your-own-adventure story where I had just happened to make all the wrong decisions. Like at the page in the story that asked, should you go on the date or stay in with your family? Because you put your dog down that afternoon. I probably should have stayed in with my family. At the page in the story that asked, should you smoke weed and drink beer? Probably not the best idea. And especially at the point in the story that asked, should you have unprotected sex with this guy that you are on a second date with that has a tribal tattoo across his chest, and a Christmas tree up in his house, and it was June. Just some like weird stuff. That should have been a no-brainer. On top of feeling pretty shit about the whole situation, I found it really hard to locate an abortion provider in the area. Despite being in the southwestern suburbs of Philadelphia, by all accounts a major progressive city, I couldn't find any abortion providers within a reasonable driving distance. Finally, after days of searching, I found a women's health provider in South Jersey that said on its website that it provided abortions. Shout out to the Cherry Hill Women's Center. And I don't know if there's any New Jersey people in the house, but you might know what Cherry Hill is. And I was, Philly, yeah, close by. So I was able to get an appointment later that week. Okay, so I had an appointment, great. But how was I gonna pay for it? If you'll remember to earlier in the story, I was broke and unemployed at the time, and I estimated that the procedure was gonna cost at least a few $100s, and insurance certainly wasn't gonna pay for it. So I had decided to reach out to the guy that I had sex with to see if he might want to chip in. Things had fizzled out between us after the third date, but I figured he might want to help me out of my predicament, considering he had helped me get into it. But when I texted him asking for help, he flatly refused. There must be some kind of mistake, he said. There's no way I could be the dad. I use the pull-out method all the time. I'm like the pull-out king. And none of those other girls have gotten pregnant. Plus, I smoke a lot of pot, and pot reduces sperm count. So really, there's no way I could be the dad. That's really true. He really said all those things. Okay, I said. I was not in the mood to get into a long back and forth with this stoner asshole about his role in the pregnancy, so I decided to seek help elsewhere. It ended up being my mom who came to the rescue. She not only loaned me the money that I needed for the abortion, she also volunteered to drive me to the clinic later that week. I realize now how fortunate I am to have had a family member who was there for me during that time. Shout out to my mom, I guess. So once the abortion was over, I felt such a flood of relief. I no longer had a fetus growing inside me that I didn't want to have there. Plus, I was proud that I had overcome my anxiety and gone through with the procedure. I still felt some pangs of guilt and shame, but they were slowly starting to fade away. A couple days after the abortion, I went over to my friend Catherine's house to talk through what had happened. Catherine is from Germany and had only come over to the US a few years prior. And don't worry, I'm not going to try and do her accent. I could, but nope, no. Of course you got the abortion, she said. Why on earth would you have had that weed baby? In Europe, abortion is way more normal and out in the open. Why do Americans make such a big deal out of it? She was the first person I had spoken with who talked about abortions not being a big deal, not being something to feel guilty or ashamed about. Luckily for me, in the 4 years since I had the abortion, I've encountered a lot more women who feel the same way. Abortion's not a big deal. It's just like any other healthcare procedure. And it turns out abortion is way more common than I thought, and not just for careless teenagers, for all sorts of women, even 27-year-olds with master's degree who are crashing on their brother's couch. I've always been really hard on myself, pushing myself to be the best person possible. Some people call it perfectionism. Other people call it type A personality. My mom used to call it, Elisabet, you know you can get a B on your report card every once in a while. But I'm happy to say now that getting an abortion 4 years ago is no longer something I get down on myself for. I was sad and lost, and I behaved somewhat carelessly. But with the help of my mom and some great healthcare providers in South Jersey, I was able to do what was best for my body and for my future. And I guess my choose your own adventure story didn't turn out so bad after all.